The first punch didn't land on his face, it landed on the trust he thought he had in the city. The second came just as quickly, shoving him into a wall, his breath cut short under the weight of authority he never consented to. Rain slicked the sidewalks of Manhattan, blurring the reflections of neon signs and late-night traffic. David Carter, 28, had been chasing a lead for tomorrow's front-page story, one he thought could shake the city's political elite. His notebook, still warm from the coffee shop where he'd been scribbling notes, now lay face down in a puddle, ink bleeding into the gutter. The officer didn't ask questions. He didn't check ID. He saw a black man in a dark coat lingering near a jewelry store after hours, and that was enough. The city taught its officers to be quick. Quicker than thought, quicker than truth. Hands where I can see them. The voice boomed over the muffled hum of distant traffic. David froze. Not because he was guilty, but because he'd learned from childhood that sudden moves could cost him more than an arrest. But freezing didn't save him. A hand rough, gloved, and shaking with adrenaline yanked him sideways. His back hit the brick wall, the chill seeping through his coat. Pain bloomed along his ribs where the officer's forearm pressed in, a cruel reminder that control wasn't always in the hands of the lawful. "Name," the officer barked. David's voice cracked with the weight of both fear and indignation. "David Carter. I'm." "Shut up." The officer's face was inches away now, eyes sharp and searching, as if daring him to contradict the narrative already forming in his head. His badge gleamed in the rain-light. O'Connell. A name David would remember long after the bruises faded. Somewhere down the block, a taxi honked. A couple paused mid-step, their conversation dying in their throats as they caught sight of the scene. One reached for their phone. David didn't resist. He'd learned better than to feed the beast with defiance. But there was a different kind of power in restraint, one that would matter more once the truth saw daylight. "I'm a journalist," he said, each word deliberate. The grip on his arm faltered for a fraction of a second. The officer blinked, as if the title itself carried the threat of consequence. "From the New York Sentinel," David added, his tone flat but edged with quiet fire. For the first time, O'Connell really looked at him, not the skin, not the coat, but the eyes. The same eyes that had stared down senators in press briefings, CEOs in corporate scandals, and crooked officials who thought they could outmaneuver the press. Rain trickled between them, a cold reminder of the city's indifference. But in that moment, something shifted. Not enough to erase the shove, the humiliation, the sheer violence of assumption, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in the officer's mind. "Get your ID out," O'Connell muttered, stepping back. His voice had lost some of its force, replaced by a brittle defensiveness. David's hands moved slowly, methodically, every movement calculated, because even here, even now, the wrong gesture could rewrite the ending in the worst way. He produced his press badge, laminated and official, the gold letters catching the light. O'Connell stared at it longer than necessary, his jaw tight. "You're recovering something?" "Trying to," David replied. "Until you decided I was something else." The officer's gaze flicked to the growing number of onlookers. Cameras were out now, recording not just the scene but the power dynamic that had unfolded without hesitation. David knew this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the kid watching from across the street who might one day stand where he stood. It was about every story that began with suspicion and ended with a headline no one wanted to read. "You should watch yourself out here," O'Connell said, handing the badge back. His tone carried a strange mix of warning and retreat. David took it without breaking eye contact. "Maybe you should too." The air between them hung heavy with unspoken truths. Neither moved for a moment, the officer unwilling to fully admit fault, the journalist unwilling to let it slide. Finally, O'Connell stepped back, muttering something into his radio. David turned away, retrieving his soaked notebook from the gutter. The ink was smeared, but the story was still there. And now, so was a new one he hadn't planned on telling, but maybe needed to. The city had just handed him a different lead. One about power, perception, and the cost of being seen the wrong way in the right place at the wrong time. He wasn't sure yet how it would end, but he knew it would be read. David's shoes squelched against the wet pavement as he started walking again, the weight of the encounter pressing into his shoulders like an invisible coat he couldn't take off. His breath still came sharp, not from running, but from holding back the 1,000 words he wanted to unleash. He knew the first rule of journalism was objectivity, But what did objectivity mean when the story bled into your own skin? The rain eased into a mist, hanging low over the street like smoke. He ducked into the corner bodega for a coffee, partly to warm his hands and partly to shake the feeling of every eye still watching him. The bell over the door jingled, and the warmth of frying oil and fresh bread hit him. Rough night. The cashier, a Dominican man named Luis who'd been behind that counter for 15 years, eyed him with the weary sympathy of someone who'd seen the city chew up more than its share of people. "You could say that," David murmured, sliding a few bills across the counter. His fingers trembled just enough for Luis to notice. "You look like you just saw a ghost." "No," David said, meeting his gaze. "A cop." Luis gave a slow, knowing nod. He didn't ask for details, didn't have to. In this neighborhood, you didn't need the specifics to know the story. The same plot had played out too many times, with different names and faces, but identical endings. David took his coffee and moved to the back of the shop, sinking into a plastic chair under the flickering light. He pulled his notebook from his bag. The pages were warped, the ink blotched, but the bones of his original story were still there. And now, another narrative had started writing itself in the margins. He stared at the words illegal zoning meeting, corrupt permits, city councilman Reyes, and realized something bitter. The same systemic rot that let developers buy their way around the law was kin to the rot that made a cop see him as a threat first and a citizen second. It wasn't two stories anymore. It was one. He began scribbling, his handwriting jagged with adrenaline. Every detail of the encounter with O'Connell, the voice, the grip, the pause when he'd said, "journalist," went down on paper. Facts first. Always facts. Even when they hurt. The bell over the door jingled again. David didn't look up until a voice said, "Carter." He froze. That tone wasn't friendly. When he glanced up, O'Connell was standing there, rainwater still dripping from his patrol cap, his radio crackling faintly at his side. The cashier's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say a word. "What do you want?" David asked, his voice steady enough to make it sound like he wasn't bracing for round two. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "You planning to write about this?" David didn't answer right away. He studied O'Connell's face, not angry now, but tight, guarded, like a man already thinking of the fallout before it hit. "I'm a journalist," David said finally. "It's my job to write about what happens." "You know how it'll look," O'Connell muttered. "They'll tear me apart. My career might take the same hit mine would've if you'd booked me for nothing." David cut in. "That's the thing about actions, officer. They come with consequences." O'Connell glanced at the floor, then back at him. "Look, I made a mistake. But you've got to understand, the call came in about a suspicious guy in a dark coat hanging around a store. I didn't." "Didn't what?" David's voice sharpened. "Didn't see the press badge? Didn't think to ask? Or didn't care until you realized who I was?" The tension in the shop was thick enough to taste. Luis, from behind the counter, shifted his weight, his hand resting near the baseball bat he kept for late-night trouble. "I'm not your enemy," O'Connell said, but his tone carried less conviction than his words. "This city, it's not simple. We don't get the luxury of slowing down." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Maybe you should. Because one of these days, the rush you're talking about is going to kill someone who didn't deserve to die. And then it won't just be your career on the line, it'll be someone's life." The officer's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to the door as though considering a quick exit. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed a crumpled business card on the table. "If you're going to write it," he said, "at least hear my side. Off the record." David stared at the card. He could feel the ethical tightrope stretching in front of him. This was more than just a source. This was the subject himself, asking for mercy in the language of negotiation. He didn't pick up the card. "Not yet. I'll think about it," David said. O'Connell gave a short nod, turned, and left. The bell chimed again, and the shop felt bigger without him in it. Luis walked over, glancing at the card still on the table. "You gonna call him?" David sighed. "Maybe. But first, I'm going to write." That night, back in his small apartment overlooking a row of battered fire escapes, David typed until the words blurred. The sound of rain against the window was steady, but his pulse wasn't. The article wasn't just about him. He wove in statistics, quotes from community leaders, past incidents that echoed the same dangerous pattern. But he kept O'Connell in it not as a villain in a uniform, but as a man who represented something larger. The problem wasn't one officer. It was a system that trained speed over scrutiny, fear over fairness. By 3 a.m., the draft was done. He read it twice, resisting the urge to soften the sharper edges. Truth was sharp. It was supposed to cut. He sent it to his editor with the subject line, "Urgent for tomorrow's print." Sleep didn't come easy. When his phone buzzed at 6:45 a.m., he thought it was his editor, but it was a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. Seconds later, a text came through. "You need to take that story down. Now." David's stomach turned. It wasn't signed. He stared at the screen, then out the window. The city was waking up, taxis honking, delivery trucks rattling over potholes, steam curling from subway grates. Somewhere out there, someone already wanted his voice silenced. And he hadn't even published yet. David's thumb hovered over the phone screen. He knew better than to reply. Replying meant engagement. Engagement meant escalation. Instead, he took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to his editor, Jenna. She was the kind of woman who wore skepticism like a coat, stylish, durable, and weatherproof. Her response came in seconds. "Publishing anyway. Come in. We'll talk security." Security. The word made his coffee taste bitter. David pulled on his coat and stepped into the street. The city's morning rush had begun in earnest, umbrellas crowding the sidewalks, the smell of bagels and exhaust blending into the air. He kept glancing over his shoulder without meaning to, scanning for faces he didn't recognize. By the time he reached the Sentinel's glass front building in Midtown, the sky had shifted from pewter to pale gray. Inside, the newsroom was a familiar chaos. Ringing phones, clicking keyboards, the low hum of TV news feeds playing in the background. Jenna was waiting near the coffee machine, her expression already tight. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You sure about this, Carter?" she asked, handing him a paper cup. "I've been sure since last night." She nodded once, as if sealing a pact. "Then it runs at noon." He followed her into her office, where the blinds were half drawn and the desk was cluttered with stacks of marked-up drafts. She closed the door. "I got a call this morning from someone in the precinct," she said. "They didn't outright threaten me, but let's just say they'd be happier if this piece never saw daylight." David raised an eyebrow. "Same here. Anonymous." "Of course." Jenna sighed. "This isn't going to be just another article. You know that. Once this is out there, your name's going to be tied to it in every search engine, every police union memo, every social media thread with an agenda." David took a slow sip of coffee. "And if I stay quiet, what changes?" For a moment, she studied him, maybe to see if the fear had sunk in yet. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'll make some calls. Friends in legal, a couple of advocacy groups. If they push back, you won't be standing alone." That was something, but not everything. At 12:01 p.m., the article went live. The headline hit like a siren. "Patrol officers' mistaken identity stops sparks debate on race, policing." The piece spread quickly, first through the Sentinel's readership, then on Twitter, then into the orbit of national outlets hungry for a human face on a systemic problem. Screenshots of David's opening paragraph began circulating, along with cell phone footage from a bystander who'd been across the street during the stop. The footage was short, only 20 seconds, but it told the whole story. The shove, the grip, the moment O'Connell's expression shifted when the word journalist landed. David hadn't known the footage existed until it surfaced. Now it was everywhere. By 1 p.m., his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Reporters from other outlets, radio producers, activists, all wanting quotes, interviews, context. By 2 p.m., his email inbox was a war zone. Half support, half venom. "You're a hero. Stop race baiting, fraud. Thank you for telling the truth. Hope you choke on your own lies." The words blurred together until they felt almost meaningless. Almost. It was 3:15 when his phone rang again. The caller ID read O'Connell. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Carter." The officer's voice was low, gravelly. "We need to talk. In person." "About what?" "Not on the phone. I'm not meeting you in some alley, if that's what you're thinking. I'm thinking somewhere public. Neutral. The diner on 8th. 10 minutes. The line went dead before David could say no. The diner was half full, the air thick with the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. O'Connell was in a booth at the back, cap off, hair still damp from the rain. David slid into the seat across from him. No handshake. No small talk. You've turned my life into a circus, O'Connell said, staring into his mug. You turned mine into a headline, David replied. Difference is, mine's true. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. You think you've got the whole picture. You don't. That call I got, it wasn't random. Someone flagged you. David frowned. Flagged me? As what? As a suspect. Anonymous tip. Said you matched the description of a guy casing stores in the area. It sounded too convenient. Too neat. You expect me to believe that? David said. I don't care what you believe. But if you're smart, you'll figure out who made that call. Because they're the one who wanted this to happen. David studied him, trying to decide if this was a deflection or a genuine lead. O'Connell didn't look smug, he looked cornered. You have proof? Not yet. But I know the system. Tips like that get logged. If someone set you up, there's a paper trail. David leaned back, crossing his arms. Why tell me this? Because I've been on the force long enough to know when I'm being used. And right now, someone's using both of us. The words hung in the air, heavier than the diner's greasy steam. When David left, the rain had picked up again. He pulled his coat tight and started walking back toward the Sentinel. But his mind was no longer on the article, it was on the call. If O'Connell was telling the truth, someone had deliberately engineered the encounter. And if that someone had connections in both city politics and law enforcement, it could be bigger than either of them. His phone buzzed. Another text. This one wasn't anonymous. You're digging in the wrong place. Stop, or you'll regret it. The number traced back to nothing. A burner. David didn't stop walking. But he knew one thing, the story wasn't over. It had just changed shape. David didn't sleep that night. The message replayed in his mind, you're digging in the wrong place. Stop, or you'll regret it. He'd gotten threats before, but this one felt different. Not just anger, but orchestration. Like someone who knew exactly where he was headed and wanted to derail him before he arrived. By morning, he'd decided. If someone was pulling strings, he needed to see the hands. At the precinct archives, the smell of old paper and coffee hung in the air. O'Connell had kept his word, meeting him there in plain clothes, eyes darting like a man checking for ghosts. You're lucky I still have clearance, the officer muttered, swiping them into a back office. He slid a manila folder across the desk. This is the call log from the night I stopped you. David opened it, scanning the neat columns of timestamps and codes. His eyes landed on a specific line. 2043 anonymous tip, blackmail, late 20s, dark code, suspected burglary casing. The originating number was masked, but the routing note showed something unexpected. The call had been patched through from a private line inside City Hall. David's heart kicked hard. City Hall. O'Connell nodded grimly. Told you. Someone set this up. The pieces started aligning in David's head. His original investigation into City Councilman Reyes had already hinted at shady property deals. If Reyes wanted to discredit him before the story broke, all it would take was one anonymous tip to the right patrol officer at the right time. And O'Connell, by sheer bad luck, had been that officer. This isn't just about me, David said. It's about the councilman covering his tracks. If this blows up, he takes you down with me. O'Connell's jaw tightened. Then we take him first. They worked quietly, almost like conspirators. David tapped his contacts for anything on Reyes' phone records, while O'Connell dug into precinct dispatch logs, always careful not to leave a trace. Every hour brought them closer to the center of the web. By the third day, they had it. A copy of the internal phone directory showing the extension used for the tip assigned to Reyes' assistant. That's it, David said, his pulse steady now. That's the proof. Proof of what? O'Connell asked. That the whole thing was staged. Which means the public stop wasn't an accident, it was a smear attempt that backfired. O'Connell gave a dry laugh. Guess I was collateral damage. David met his eyes. We both were. They arranged a meeting with Jenna, sliding the evidence across her desk like contraband. She read it twice, the corners of her mouth pulling tight. This isn't just going to make waves, she said finally. This is going to set off a storm. Then let's get wet, David replied. The follow-up article ran under a headline even more explosive than the first. City Hall tied to staged police stop targeting investigative journalist. The reaction was immediate. TV crews camped outside City Hall. Reyes denied everything, but the phone records told a cleaner story than his soundbites. Activist groups staged rallies. Hashtags flooded social media, calling for his resignation. For O'Connell, The fallout was mixed. Some praised him for coming forward, others accused him of turning on his own. The union issued a tepid statement about procedural review, but David could see the toll it took on the officer's shoulders. "You're not used to being the good guy in someone else's story," David said one night as they left the newsroom together. O'Connell gave a faint smile. "Guess you're not used to sharing the byline." 2 weeks later, Reyes stepped down, citing family reasons. The city knew better. The night the news broke, David walked alone through the same block where it had all begun. The rain was back, pooling in the cracks of the pavement, turning neon into rivers of color. He thought about how close he'd come to being just another headline: "Black man stopped, questioned, released." A footnote in a news cycle that chewed through lives like cheap gum. But it hadn't ended there. It had become something bigger, not because the system worked, but because two men, forced together by circumstance and distrust, had refused to let the script play out the way it was written. He paused outside the jewelry store, watching the light catch on the display. A cab rolled by, splashing his shoes, but he didn't move. His phone buzzed. A message from O'Connell. "Drinks? My turn to buy." David typed back, "Make it somewhere quiet." As he slipped the phone into his pocket, he realized the city hadn't changed overnight. People still hurried past without looking. Somewhere, another call was being made, another life about to be spun into a version of the truth that served someone else. But maybe, just maybe, the next person caught in that machinery would find a way to jam it, too. Because now the story was out there. And stories, once told, had a way of living longer than the lies they exposed. David turned up his collar against the rain and kept walking. The notebook in his bag was dry this time, and full of blank pages. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.